welcome. Often in our quest to study the state of the world, we forget something. For often we see crazy evil dictators or socialist demagogues or the ruined remains of something that was once great and mighty, like Russia after the fall of Taboritsky. But in doing all this, we forget. We forget the stories of the thousands who actually live in these places, who actually exist in the world. And today I'm going to be narrating 17 such tales in the TNO world, or was it 16? Anyway, the number doesn't really matter. Sent by my subscribers in a community post that I made many years ago. So let's begin directly. The first story is by Fathi Herol 6907, Mehmet Akinki, a Turkish person who lives in Istanbul but stays in Damascus for business. He is a journalist of an opposition newspaper called Zafer, and his political beliefs are classic liberalism. Mehmet Akinki used to be a journalist working for the government, but the CHP, the Kemalist party's autocratization every day drove him away from the party. He was expelled from the newspaper after he wrote an article criticizing the government's economic policy. He also found himself among the cadres of the newly established UDP at that time. Thanks to his friends in the party, he found a job in a new newspaper in a short time. On the move to Damascus to observe the Second Italo-Turkish War. But, sadly for him, Cevdet Sunay's orthodox CHP Kemalist faction took over power. Turkey won the Italo-Turkish War. Despite his opposition to the CHP, Mehmet Akinki was happy about Turkey's victory in the Italo-Turkish War, and during the war he found himself a nice estate in northern Syria, which he purchased as a second home. Meanwhile in Turkey, things did not improve for the UDP, the party that Akinki supported. Internal squabbling about liberalism and Islam left it weak, and the CHP continued to win election after election after election, with Cevdet Sunay's orthodox faction of the CHP taking over. By 1970, the oil crisis started, and the CHP's popularity finally started to decline. Regardless, the CHP still continues to be in control of Turkey. Meanwhile, there was more bad news for our hero Akinki. Thanks to the oil crisis, Salah Jadid's men seized power in Syria and declared a Marxist Arab nationalist regime, which then unified with the United Arab Republic. So Akinki now continues to be in Turkey fighting for the UDP party and has lost everything that he once owned in Syria. What a sad fate. Moving on. We have Yuri Andreawich, a character submitted by Christian Broadbent 7489. He is a Russian boot shiner, a slave in Reichskommissariat Moscow. He was born to a middle-class family of cobblers during the Russian Empire and was conscripted into the Imperial Army fighting on the Eastern Front from 1915 to 17, where he was scared mentally by his experiences during the Brusilov offensive. But thanks to a lack of understanding of PTSD, he was forced to stay in the fighting until finally he deserted and then briefly lived between sympathetic families as he traveled through war-torn and then later civil war-torn land back to his hometown in the Moscow Oblast. Under the USSR, he slowly patched his life back together and started a family until Operation Barbarossa thundered through his fragilely constructed normalcy. 3 of his sons went to war, but none of them came back. 2 were killed by the German war machine, while the last fled to the east beyond the AA lines, somewhere inside the remains of Russia at the time. Yuri himself was forcefully separated from his wife and deported to newly named Moscow, where he was forced to work as a boot shiner under a German master due to previous experiences working as a cobbler. The mental strain and his previous PTSD, coupled with the destruction of his family, broke Yuri, and the second defeat of his nation by Germany, all the while being enslaved under brutal condition, collapsed his will to resist, as all he did was shining the boots to the colonialists who had infested Moscow. The routine of boot shining was monotonous, but it granted Yuri moments of reflection, memories of his family, the laughter of his children, and the life that he had once known haunted him. The faces of his fallen sons played across his mind like a bittersweet slideshow, a reminder of the sacrifices his family had made for their homeland. He oversaw events in Germany like the time of troubles, the brief fracture of his own Moscow, but he was too powerless to fight for Russia during those 2 precious years of pseudo-independence and warlordism before the Germans reconquered Moscow from the Russian warlords that had taken it over. Soon, by the early 1970s, he even came to thank God for being in Moscow and not in the dangerous hinterland of Russia, where the cursed regent massacred the very soul of what remained. He knew now that his son was dead, and all that remained were the charred remains of a once dead Russia, as the regent ruined it all for the return of Tsar Alexei. But then one day, while polishing a particularly well-worn pair of boots, Yuri noticed a small piece of paper tucked inside the lining. He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing, before carefully extracting it. The note was written in Russian, hidden away by someone who had perhaps glimpsed his despair. "I too have lost loved ones to this war," it said. "But we must not lose our hope. Resistance lives in the heart of those who remember. Father." And at that moment Yuri's eyes brimmed with tears as he clutched the note to his chest. Their meeting, the first after decades, was brief. His son was now a missionary, a secret one. He worked for the nearby Christian Republic of Samara under Vladimir Pimen. He invited Yuri to join him and guide him, and that's where Yuri Andreawich once again disappears from the records of Deutsche Moskowine and enters the records of legends. The third character is much less emotion and more practicality, submitted by KR-YW3PB, Toyama Munayaki. He lives in the Kamayaga in the Chiba prefecture and is a national conservative, a right-wing reformist, geopolitical analyst. Toyama Munayaki is one of Japan's leading geopoliticists. He is known for his interventions in newspapers and televisions to explain conflicts such as the Russo-German War of the 1950s and the Arab Wars. He agrees that the Japanese system of Ino-Hiroya is corrupted by extremists and disturbs fascists who consider it to be too corrupt and dictatorial. For Toyama, the world needed a new world order based on democracy and traditions. He even had secret contacts with German collaborators who supported Albert Speer at the last political meeting before civil war in Germania. He planned to go to Germany and convince Japanese politicians to rally behind Speer once in power, but no one knew when or how Speer would come to power. Munayaki stayed in Japan because he didn't know what was really going on in Germany. But according to some, German students wanted freedom, and Munayaki was rallying to the cause of these German students, despite being a resident of the Empire of Japan. He wanted to bring about yet another change in Toyama's ideas, his own ideas. This made him an enemy of the fascist extremists, but a hope for the rest of the parties to create a new country. Initially, Toyama supported Ikeda Masanosuke's government for trying to Initially, he hated Ikeda Masanosuke's government for trying to establish a one-party state. But after his son's marriage in 1964, he observed how the latter became more disciplined thanks to being tethered to one horse. Toyama decided that Japan is the same. It needed a firm hand. So what if Ikeda and his men are a little dictatorial? They aren't corrupt, and they aren't fascist either in the pure sense. He suddenly changed his rhetoric in the mid 60s and started praising the government, which brought him trouble from his own old democratic friends. He pointed to them how American democracy had become weak thanks to a series of weak leaders. He pointed to them how Gus Hall's coming was a huge issue, and he was proven right when Gus Hall was elected President of America, when America lost the very thing that had made itself so great liberal, conservative democracy. Toyama still hates the colonial policy of Ikeda, but he believes Ikeda is the new mage. This has also enabled to get him to his son in higher government jobs, and overall Toyama is happy with the results. He is a practical man living in a practical world, a world where Japan dominates Asia. The next character was submitted by Venezas, Raul de Ker Silva, an Afro-Dutch Brazilian resident of Sao Paulo. Raul was an industrial worker and syndicalist. He believed wholeheartedly in the cause of syndicalism. He was born in 1944 in Brazil, in Bahia. After that, he moved to the south to the state of Sao Paulo at the age of 15 to try for a better life with his older brothers. In the ensuing years, he became largely left-wing and joined a union. Unlike his entire family, he had the opportunity to study and learn that he was interested in history, which triggered a desire to study more and more, which made him even more radical. This led him to find content about Spanish anarcho-syndicalism from various books. But what really influenced him was the ideology of Amazonism and Brazilian communism, obviously closer to the Brazilian reality. However, his fate was not as good. In Brazil, in the 1960s, Getulio Vargas Filho, the son of Getulio Vargas, took over power. Meanwhile, our hero Raul decided to flee, and he chose a new place to flee, Ecuador, where Che Guevara had launched a successful rebellion in the heart of the Amazon. He joined Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare and eventually became a big shot in the community of syndicalists in Che Guevara's band in Ecuador. Shortly afterwards, Che Guevara left Ecuador and left it to Manuel Agustin Aguirre. Meanwhile, Raul joined Manuel's cabinet in Quito and became a key member of the defense staff. He also became somewhat of a legend himself, as he led aborted campaigns to remove the fascist regime of Manuel Otria in Peru and also the Vargas regime in Brazil. He even attacked Julian Mendoza Guerrero's Catholicists in Colombia, but ultimately all of these campaigns failed miserably. Today, in 1976, Raul remains in Ecuador, hoping to spread Che Guevara's revolution further and further the cause of the red flag that now flies high, at least for Ecuador. The next character was submitted by Yani Bambang 3047. So this character is obviously Indonesian. The name of this character is Bambang Samarjonu. So let us take a look at Bambang Samarjonu. He is a novelist and journalist. Let's just call him Bambang. He is a novelist and journalist with center-right or social populist thoughts. He was born in 1924 and lives in Jakarta. He was born to a poor family in Purwokerto. He worked really hard to become an aspiring novelist since he was a teenager. His father unfortunately died in 1944 when Bambang was 20 years old because he was caught by the Kempetai police for his anti-Japanese views in Indonesia. In 1948, Bambang wrote a novel about life in Indonesia under Japanese occupation, and it became a hit success with favorable reviews. And even some famous writers like Hamka and Chairil Anwar were a big fan of his novels. In 1951, and from then on till 1959, he wrote four other novels about the topic of Indonesian democracy and social structure. In 1961, he was arrested by the Kempetai units due to his alleged links to Indonesian underground resistance movements, but he was freed by an underground resistance member who disguised as a Kempetai field officer. In 1962, he worked as a journalist for Java Post newspaper. Plus, he had some political friends like Johannes Laimana, Idham Chalid, and even the vice president at the time, Muhammad Hatta. Bambang continued to write against the Sukarno regime in the early 1960s. Then, during the ensuing Indonesian civil war, he switched sides to join Muhammad Hatta. But when it came to the actual fighting, it lost its appeal for him. He could not connect well with ground level fighting and guerrillas and soldiers. He quickly became sidelined as a sort of bourgeoisie academic. After witnessing several gruesome deaths during the Civil War, he emigrated to the United States. And that was a good thing, because unfortunately for Bambang, Sukarno won the Civil War. Later on, Later on, he became a criminal but was acquitted in a mass peace deal with the rebels, where minor rebels were allowed to return to Indonesia. But by 1972, as Gus Hall got elected president, Bambang finally decided to cut all ties with America and return back to Indonesia. He started his own farm and dropped his political activities. He returned back to where he had started, a rural farmer living in a land where all hope had been lost. Our next character was submitted by Muhammad Firdaus bin Syarom 2494. The name of the character is Carl Thomas. He is an Afrikaner South African who lives in Durban. He is a liberal progressive and is in the South African Army. Nkosi Sikelel ya Afrika, the sentence of equality. Carl even thought his parents want to raise him as a conservative. He hated them. Since high school after 1956, he saw a funeral for a deceased member of the African National Congress, and the Song of Freedom stuck his heart. He already had some sympathy for the ANC cause and he started to gain an interest in socialism. But as 1962 rolled around and the threat of the Boer insurrection and the formation of the Afrika Shield loomed overhead, he joined the army out of patriotism. He had inspiration to become the governor of Durban as an ANC moderate candidate. But then the Civil War started. In the brutal Civil War, Carl Thomas tried to fight on the side of the ANC, but the ANC were defeated, and after being stuck in the forest for 2 years, Carl Thomas returned back to civilization. Meanwhile, the South African Civil War, basically ended in a sort of stalemate. The Germans won the war and the Americans were defeated, but at a cost. For after the Germans won the war, they collapsed. Africa collapsed into various warlord states, each more cruel than the others. Meanwhile, Carl Thomas returned back to civilization after the ceasefire. But he was completely battered. After attempting to put out a napalm fire, he lost sight in both of his eyes. Then he retired to a small cabin in Cape Town, where he remains to this day. The scars of war never left him. Not all stories end in good or even neutral endings, friends. Some just end in napalm fires. Our next story is of Wang Dinja. It was submitted by Jurassic Park 2 Enjoyer. Once again, I completed his half submitted story, as is the case of all these stories here. He is a Maoist freedom fighter who lives in Shaanxi but then fled to the 40th NRA Army Group, which is also known as the Ma Clique. So basically, he fled from Shaanxi to the Ma Clique under Ma Jiwan. After the death of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, Wang Dinja, who was an ardent communist, found himself hunted down by collaborationists and the Japanese, causing him to group with Kuomintang and communist remains, who started small uprisings in Japanese China, culminating in the Guangzhou massacre, where they set bombs off in a Zaibatsu concession which killed several people. After this attack, the men were identified and hunted down by the Imperial Japanese Army, causing the CLA, Wang's group, to break down, forcing him to escape north to NRA-controlled Mark Lake, where he now lives, plotting the reclamation of the Chinese mainland. But that was in 1962. After 1962, he joined Long Yun's struggle and fought bravely in the battle for China, but lost an eye. However, he had never expected how rapidly Gao's Chinese collaborators would defeat the rebellion and stop it from spreading. After the Great Asian War, Wang retreated back to Qinghai, but his own brothers turned on him and drove him out. He decided to move to Russia and plotted his revenge. Somehow he gained a high rank, working as a mercenary for the Holy Regent. He started to command his own battalion of fanatics and murderers to cleanse Russia and prepare it for the Tsarevich Alexei's return. However, when the whole project crashed, he took the battalion to Qinghai and tracked down and attacked his traitorous brothers. In the ensuing battle at a farmstead outside Gansu, he managed to defeat the traitors, but at the cost of losing his whole brigade. Now, with no brigade and no brothers to live for, he roams the wastes of Siberia as an old, broken, and defeated man, with nothing but the memories of the old China to accompany him. The next story was submitted by History with Rover. The name of this character is Hubert LaRoche. He was born in. He is one of the oldest character in this list, for he was born in 1893. Hubert LaRoche was a Frenchman, a general in the Free French Army of Charles de Gaulle, who once lived in Abidjan. Nicknamed La Tourelle, the bull, for his aggressive determination and defensive tactics in outnumbered situations, LaRoche has been through 2 world wars and stood as one of France's last defenders in West Africa. He was one of the few generals to have some major success during the German invasion and was one of the major generals to side with Charles de Gaulle as he formed the Free French government. He was an ally of de Gaulle and a staunch reclamationist, but also an advocate of free Africa's self-determination once the homeland was freed. However, not everything went well for the Free French. In the 1960s, the Free French were engaged in a brutal struggle with the Pan-African Liberation Front led by Félix Roland Momi's West African Union and Kwame Nkrumah's African Socialist. In the ensuing war, Hubert LaRoche employed tactics which he had learned in both the world wars, but none of them worked. The Free French lacked the fanaticism of the Pan-Africanists, and eventually they were pushed back all the way to the lonely island of Port-aux-Françaises, where Philippe Leclerc continues to be in exile. However, LaRoche did not survive it. One day, while fighting in the jungles of Cameroon, he found himself separated from the battered remains of his own battalion. Yes, he, a great general, had been reduced to just one battalion. For many days they tried to trek south to find the ocean from where they could go to safety to Spanish Santa Isabel. However, they did not manage. Instead, they found themselves in the Orungu national state of Nazaria Bolungi. There they were summarily executed as traitors. And that is how the story of LaRoche, the great French general who had seen it all, ended, just as the story of France ended with him. The next story is by TFERHOL2270. And the name is actually Vladimir Nabokov, who is a real character in TNO. Born in an aristocratic family, Vladimir left Russia after the Russian Civil War because of his political views. His father was a liberal and one of the founders of the Cadeti. Later, the father of Nabokov, who was also named Vladimir, was murdered by Pyotr Shabelsky-Borg and Sergei Taboritsky. Nabokov was exiled in France and Switzerland during the Second World War, but returned to Russia to save it and make his father proud with a white Russia under a liberal democracy, to transform it into a modern and peaceful state. He returned to Komi specifically, where he tried warning Democrats to ally with the leftists, lest the far right take over. He involved himself with women like Svetlana Bukharina and Svetlana Stalina. But eventually they all failed and were caught like other liberals by Taboritsky's men. Vladimir Nabokov, however, escaped Taboritsky's wrath and fled to the USA. He retired from politics, believing it to have vanished. He believed that the soul of Russia had really died with Taboritsky and there was no point in getting it back. He decided to go back to Russia to try again after the collapse of Taboritsky, but decided against it at the last moment. Yes, he truly believed that Russia was dead, and this time there was no saving it. Meanwhile, his own home in France was ransacked by the Nazis, so there was nowhere to go for him but stay in the United States of America until his death. The next character is Yelena Oblinski by Johnny Rebel 2761. She lived in Zeya, which was under Rozdaevsky's men during the Russian warlord stage. She believed in Oblinski's National Socialism, her own take on Nazism. She used to be a propagandist working for Rozdaevsky's regime, but the anti-German sentiment and the anti-Tsarist policies of Rozdaevsky drove her secretly away from the party without the government knowing. She created her own branch of Nazism called Oblinskism. Basically, it's the idea of unifying Russia under a more nationalistic and capitalistic National Socialism that advocates for the suppression of the left, considered as communists, undesirables, etc., and the unification of Slavic people under one banner which is known as Pan-Slavism. Basically, capitalist Pan-Slavism, which also advocates for a diplomatic approach to the Greater German Reich and a hostility and rivalry against the OFN. Her goal was to overthrow Rozdaevsky with a coup and take over the Russian national state, and to establish her own ideology over Russia to make it a superpower like the United States of America or the Germans or the Japanese. Unfortunately, she failed. After some time, she decided to join Matkovsky so she could take down Rozdaevsky, but she grew disillusioned with his moderate stance on fascism. And then she decided to keep switching sides until finally she joined Taboritsky. But at the opportune moment when Taboritsky started rounding up all the traitors, she was caught. Yelena Oblinski was caught and was killed brutally after being tortured with bayonets somewhere in Siberia. And that is how one more life was snuffed out in the wastes of Taboritsky's Russia. The next character is Luisa Fiorana Vasilevska, which was submitted by a larger flame 5556. She was a Black League pilot, an ultra-militarist, national revanchist woman who was born in 1932. Raised in the chaos of the Great Patriotic War in Ryazan, Luisa grew up with a red-hot hatred for the Nazi invaders to the west. Having witnessed her father die fighting the Wehrmacht and the building housing her brother collapsing by a Luftwaffe bombing raid, it was only natural as she saw it that she should try to avenge her family. She resettled in Perm after the war ended and joined what remained of the Night Witches of the West Russian Revolutionary Front in the early 1950s. Her first opportunity for revenge came and left with the West Russian War, where she countered numerous planes in the West Russian War shot out of the sky by her own whims. After the front collapsed and retreated northward, she returned to Perm, or at least attempted to, until the Aryan Brotherhood's meteoric rise prompted her to flee further eastward across the Urals. She regrouped with her comrades in Surgut and spent the next 3 years shooting down Luftwaffe bombers from the sky across western Russia, making a name for herself as the Woman of Revenge. Although she admired her comrades' mission of protection, Luisa still felt incomplete. She didn't just want to protect, she wanted to liberate. She wanted to avenge. She wanted to kill the Germans. And so she turned her destination towards Omsk, where she landed at the Black League's recruitment center. Although some commanders were unsure of the idea of allowing a woman into their ranks, no one was willing to reject an esteemed and experienced pilot like her, who also closely sympathized with their revanchist views. Now presumed dead back in Surgut after the destruction of Russia by Taboritsky and the defeat of Omsk, Luisa works in secret with the Black League in Omsk. She quickly rose through the ranks earlier when Yazov was still at the peak of her power and gained a reputation as one of the highest ranking female warriors of the Black League. Omsk was defeated by Taboritsky. Luisa spent some time in Moscow after that as a humble babysitter for children of wealthy Russian collaborator families, living under the hood. Unbelievable for a woman of her stature. She joined Alexander Lazarenko's Redeemed Black League after that. She was horrified by its weird beliefs about Russia. For unlike Yazov, Lazarenko believed that only Russians living inside the borders of the Redeemed Black League were real Russians. But even more horrifying was that Luisa began to believe in this twisted ideology herself. She became cruel and fanatic in the service of the Redeemed Black League, where she remains to this day in Yekaterinburg. Now she believes that even the Russians on the other side of the borders in Novosuralsk are traitors and not true Russians. She wants to kill them all. She believes that the path of violence is now the only one, and that only fire shall purify Russia now, even more so than the fires by which Taboritsky attempted to purify Russia. The next character is Francois Gabriel Salazar, a French-Spanish Burgundian who lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His beliefs are central egalitarianism. The character was submitted by Jesse James Salazar, Brenesse 6456. Francois loved studying the stars through his telescope when he was a kid, and always wanted to teach people about the amazing things that lay beyond our own solar system. His mother was from Spain, while his father was French. Francois lived in rural Burgundy his whole life until the 1950s when Himmler was given control of the region. Sadly, his father and mother were shortly after killed by the German SS. Francois himself was briefly captured by the SS guards for his views being too egalitarian, but he was lucky enough to escape from their grasp. Eventually, he got on a cargo ship heading towards Houston to safety in the United States of America. He got citizenship but was very poor at the time, so he applied for university at the University of New Mexico, since at the time it was in his own budget. He settled down in Albuquerque as his permanent residence. He was fascinated with the Roswell alien crash of the 1940s. His fascination fueled his determination to uncover the truth about the universe, and he dedicated his research to understanding the possibility of what lay beyond Earth. His breakthroughs and contributions to the field of astronomy did not go unnoticed by his peers, and he gained great recognition for his works, with his lectures on aliens drawing large crowds of eager students and space enthusiasts throughout the 1960s. However, he received the gut-wrenching news of his own family being killed by Raoul Salan's cruel men in France in the late 1960s. Over the years, Francois, now a broken man, continued to push the boundaries of knowledge in his field. He collaborated with other leading astronomers and contributed to numerous research projects. As Francois looked through his telescope, he couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. He had gone from a war-torn Europe to the vast expanses of the American Southwest, where he had realized his childhood dream of studying the stars and sharing his passion with the world. But in that long process, he had lost everything else. The next character is Pasquale Pasala, submitted by Cristiano Paone 3738. Cristiano Paone 3738. He is an Italo-French man who lives in Naples but also in Jerusalem for work, and is a moderate fascist. Born in a family of the Napolitan bourgeoisie and a French mother, he entered the Black Shirts after the death of his younger brothers at the hands of the communist militias to avenge him. In 1922, after the March on Rome and the seizure of power by the fascists, he rose through the ranks of the militia and in 1933 married a young noblewoman of liberal orientation with whom he had two children, one of whom occupies a position in the Grand Council of Fascism today, with a reformist position, and the other is part of the Italian embassy in Azad Hind. At the outbreak of the war, with the rank of captain, Pasquale received two bravery crosses for two heroic actions in the African theater, where he captured one position alone, filled with English forces. That gained him huge heroic elations from the Italian people. After the war, he became general of the militia, assuming reformist positions towards fascism and increasingly convinced that the monarchy is the glue that holds the nation together. In 1960, after a scandal involving the Podesta of Naples and himself, he was sent to the east as military advisor to the governor Dalla Chiesa of Jerusalem with the task of taking part in the creation of real armed forces, assuming more and more anti-Turkish positions. Unfortunately, the Turks won the Italo-Turkish War, and Pasquale and all the other advisors had to flee after the communists seized power in Palestine and merged with the United Arab Republic. Pasquale now lives in the UAE, and he is quite wealthy as he has started a new business of giving arms to Jewish terrorist groups who reside in the United Arab Republic and attempt to liberate Jerusalem for the Star of Jehovah. The next character was submitted by Yeri Yery 345. The name of the character is Juliano Vasquez, and he is a Peruvian Fascist lawyer. Giuliano was born in the Peruvian city of Trujillo, being a descendant of Italian immigrants. He was taught every aspect of Italian culture. His city suffered instability because of the subversive acts of the APRA, the major socialist group and party in the country. Later on, he moved to the capital of Lima and began his law and political studies, greatly interested and fascinated by the winning Axis powers. Overall, his parents' motherland of Italy, controlled by Benito Mussolini, really fascinated him. After graduating from college, Giuliano started to climb up in the law profession, the thing that made him know his future wife. The two started a family, although the joy of his first son would last very short because of his new diplomatic job that would make him busy and in constant movement from city to city away from his family. As a diplomat, he scaled in the position until he became an ambassador. In the new job, he was assigned to various embassies in South America, with the most remarkable being in Argentina, where he met and talked with the Argentine dictator Juan Domingo Perón, until he was eventually transferred to the embassy of Italy. There, he would study the Second World War and the Italian culture in more detail. He planned to resign his job so that he could return to Peru and have some time with his family. He finally did that and then started a new life as a politician of a renovated UR, the biggest fascist party of the 30s, under Manuel Odria, a dictator who wanted the extermination of opera and the assimilation of Native Americans, along with the Europeanization of Peru. Today, in 1976, he continues to serve Manuel Odria's oligarchy. He is a wholehearted supporter of Odria's fascism and is a high-ranking lawyer and a Peruvian High Court judge. He also delved into making some of the first Peruvian films for Manuel Odria's propaganda, as he is a fiery orator. Overall, Juliano has become one of Odria's Speer. He is Odria's Albert Speer, a close friend, and has achieved a high rank along with a good salary for all his relatives. He is one of Odria's most ardent supporters and remains so to this day. The final character is Benito Ferrante, an Italian. The character was submitted by Now Productions 8417. He lives in Palermo and believes in the political ideology of San Sepolcrismo, or pure fascism. He is a political activist and a terrorist who used to be a member of the PNF and a follower of Ettore Mutti. However, when democracy was restored to Italy, he was involved in several fascist terrorist operations against the new government. Then Junio Valerio Borghese took over power in the 1970s. In 1973, however, Benito Ferrante and a few other fascist activists from the University of Palermo formed a terrorist subversive group called the Sicilian Black Brigades, which were active around the Palermo area and mostly known for being responsible for several high-powered political assassinations, such as the death of the Christian Democratic governor of Sicily in 1975. Overall, Benito hates Junio Valerio Borghese's moderate fascism. His group also has a civilian counterpart that is publicly not affiliated to the movement of fascists. Benito Ferrante himself denies any involvement with the Black Brigades openly and has managed to stay out of jail because of lack of evidence. Despite this, he really hates Junio Valerio Borghese. He wishes for Italy to be strong on the world stage once again. And if his views come true, then Italy shall be strong again. He also has some operatives in Ethiopia who spread terror in Addis Ababa, wishing to reconquer Ethiopia for the Italian Empire. And that is the story of the people residing. I know that not all of these stories proved out to be interesting and my narration was quite boring, but I decided to do this kind of video as an experiment. Overall, I like doing it. Comment your thoughts down below and enjoy. Have a good day.